Welcome to the deep dive. We have a fascinating stack of sources today that really connects the historical dots, examining a core universal principle, the right to speak truth to power.
Hmm.
And this isn't just about, reviewing constitutional amendments. It's about tracing the evolution of lawful dissent across millennia and through radically different civilizations.
Well, our sources today are drawn from a series called Comparative Judicial Ethics, and the theme is, I think, very powerfully stated, when speaking truth became the highest form of faith.
Right.
So what we're really tackling is the evolution of freedom of expression from, say, divine guidance in the 7th century, all the way to codified constitutional law in the 20th.
And what's so remarkable about this material is its insistence that these completely separate legal systems, separated by geography, law, time, they all share the exact same ethical foundation.
Exactly.
So I guess our mission today is to analyze three specific landmark moments. One from 7th century Modena, one from 20th century Washington, D.C., and one from Islamabad.
And the goal is to reveal that common ethical thread, the ratio decidendi, as the source calls it, that binds them all together. We're looking for the universal law that underpins this whole doctrine of dissent.
It's an exploration that really forces you to realize that ethical principles don't just follow legal structures.
No, they often precede them. They inform them. I mean, this fundamental requirement for any legitimate government, that the ruler must be accountable to the people they rule, that's what we see getting institutionalized in these dramatically different ways.
I find the premise incredibly compelling, but, here's the critical challenge right away. Are we really certain that the moral imperative, this religious or ethical duty, is truly the same thing as the purely legal concept of checks and balances?
And that is precisely the deep dive.
Right.
We're looking for the functional requirement of justice. It doesn't matter what ideological label you put on it. If justice is the goal, then the mechanism for correction simply has to be there.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start exactly at the earliest example over 1,000 years ago with a moment that defines this idea of radical accountability. We have to start with Caliph Umar ibn Al-Khattab in 7th century Medina.
Let's do it.
So we're setting the scene here in 7th century Medina. This is shortly after the passing of the Prophet. And Caliph Umar ibn Al-Khattab he's arguably one of the most powerful and effective administrators in early Islamic history.
Absolutely. He was known for his immense authority, his very strict sense of public justice, and these revolutionary administrative structures he put in place.
And his title, Al-Faruq, it means the separator of truth from falsehood.
Right.
And I think this background is crucial because it emphasizes that this man was at the absolute apex of both temporal power and ethical governance.
It is.
Yeah.
And the source highlights a specific Friday address, which is, it's a moment of profound public ritual, deep religious significance. And that's where he chose to make this statement about accountability.
Yeah, this wasn't some backroom political meeting.
No, not at all. This was public. It was spiritual theater. It was designed to establish a precedent for all future governance.
And he didn't just passively accept input. He demanded it. He initiated the confrontation himself.
From the highest position in the community, the pulpit.
Exactly.
That's the critical detail. He stood before the entire assembled community during the Friday congregation, and he posed this direct, challenging question to every single person there. It was a test.
A test of their commitment to justice.
And their perception of their own role in this new state structure that was emerging.
So detail the exact question for us, because the context of him asking it from that position of power is what makes the moment so revolutionary.
He asked very directly, "O people, if I deviate from the path of justice, what will you do?"
Wow.
Just stop there for a moment and think about the psychological implications of that question. This is the ultimate political authority, the supreme judge, the commander, and he is openly soliciting criticism, not just reluctantly accepting it.
He's basically asking them to define their own constitutional role.
Yes. Define your limits of tolerance for my error.
And the response he gets, it's not diplomatic. It wasn't some, well-reasoned treatise or a polite suggestion. It was immediate, raw, and dramatically physical.
It really underscores the tension in that room. A man rose from the crowd, and this is where the historical drama is just so perfectly encapsulated. He stood there, not just speaking, but physically demonstrating his readiness for this correction.
He had a sword.
He had a sword in his hand, and he declared with what must have been just unshakable resolve, By Allah, O Umar, we will straighten you with this sword.
I mean, that is an explicit public threat of violence against the supreme leader. In almost any other historical system, that's instant capital treason.
Oh, absolutely. The political risk that Citizen took was absolute. It was life and death.
But the revolutionary reaction from Caliph Umar is what seals the principle for the next millennium.
Instead of reacting with anger or fear or, a command for the man's execution, he smiled.
A smile.
And his reply enshrined this concept of necessary dissent forever. He said, "All praise be to Allah who placed in my nation one who will correct Umar if he errs."
That response, it transforms the relationship. It's no longer ruler and subject. It becomes a relationship of mutual guardians of justice. So here's where we move from the powerful story to the enduring principle.
Yeah.
How does the expert analysis in the source define this moment?
Well, the source defines this as the foundational Islamic concept of lawful dissent. And it hinges on a really fundamental distinction.
Which is?
Dissent that is aimed at upholding justice is not rebellion. Rebellion is. It's often defined as opposing a legitimate authority for, say, personal gain or political power, or to sow anarchy. That's generally unlawful. This was different.
Okay.
This man's action and Umar's affirmation of it established that dissent when it's motivated purely by the imperative to straighten the leader and restore haq, which means truth or fundamental right, is not only tolerated but required.
It's seen as righteousness.
Exactly. It's righteousness.
So linking it specifically to haq, to truth, is critical. It separates it from just, normal political opposition. It has to be based on an objective deviation from the truth.
Precisely. And this leads directly to the associated principle, the right to speak truth, which is known as Amr bil Maruf wa Nahi anil Munkar.
Enjoining good and forbidding wrong.
Right. And this establishes dissent as a moral and a religious obligation that's essential for maintaining a just state. So if a citizen stays silent in the face of injustice, they are also ethically culpable. The responsibility is radically decentralized.
It rests on every single person.
Yes, to maintain the ethical rigor of the state.
It's just a profound shift in political philosophy. I mean, the legitimacy of the leader is tied not to his divine right or his military power, but to his humility, his openness to immediate, even physically intimidating public correction.
And that institutionalizes accountability in the most direct way imaginable. The citizen is compelled by this divine guidance to speak up, transforming the relationship into a partnership where the people are, in effect, the ultimate guardians of the state's ethical core.
And it sets an expectation of rigor for the state that predates any modern Bill of Rights by, nearly 14 centuries?
Easily.
What's also fascinating, and something we have to reflect on for a moment, is the sheer stability required for this moment to even happen. For that man to raise a sword, he must have been operating under the assumption that his act of principled correction would be protected, not punished.
Okay, great point.
And Umar's smile validated that assumption. That shared understanding of ethical conduct is the prerequisite for all the legal structures we're about to examine.
It speaks to a very mature political culture, one where the commitment to justice transcends the temporary insecurity of the ruler. If Umar had felt insecure, the response would have been blood. His security came from his certainty in the principle of justice itself, which made that corrective voice an asset, not a threat. And that foundation, that the state needs the truth to survive, that's the crucial thread we have to carry forward.
Okay, so let's take that thread. The conviction that the leader must be corrected for justice to prevail, and let's stretch it across 1,000 years and half the globe. This is where it gets really interesting for me. How does a moment involving a sword in 7th century Arabia translate to constitutional law in 20th century America?
I mean, the gaps are immense, but our source insists the ethical echo is clear.
So what's the transition?
The transition lies in the shift from personal accountability to institutional accountability.
Okay.
The 7th century citizen used the sword to prevent the caliph from deceiving himself or the public. The 20th century Supreme Court used the First Amendment to prevent the executive branch from deceiving the public.
So the underlying goal is identical, preventing official deception.
Exactly. The method changes from a direct physical threat to an institutional defense provided by the judiciary. But the goal is the same.
Let's look at the landmark case then. New York Times v. United States in 1971. The Pentagon Papers case. I mean, this was the ultimate confrontation between the executive branch and the press.
The background is absolutely vital here. The U.S. government, specifically the Justice Department, sought a court order and injunction to prevent the New York Times and later the Washington Post from publishing a classified 47-volume history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
And this material, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, it detailed numerous instances where the government, across multiple administrations,
Yeah.
had misled the American public about the progress, the goals, the depth of the Vietnam conflict.
The stakes were astronomical. This wasn't just, embarrassing material. The government argued it compromised national security, ongoing diplomatic efforts, and could potentially endanger troops who were still in the field.
So it's government secrecy versus the public's right to know.
That's right. And the central legal issue was the government seeking what's called prior restraint blocking publication before it even happens.
And that's traditionally seen by American courts as the most severe infringement on the First Amendment, on freedom of the press.
The most severe. So for our listener who might be familiar with the concept but needs the legal mechanics, the standard the government has to meet to achieve prior restraint is incredibly high.
It's a heavy burden, right?
A very heavy burden. Chief Justice Warren Burger referred to it in the case as a burden that must show publication will surely result in direct, immediate, and irreparable damage to our nation or its people.
Wow, surely result. So not just maybe.
Not maybe. The bar is set astronomically high precisely because suppressing information, even classified information, is seen as fundamentally anti-democratic.
And the ruling came down really fast, just days after the initial injunction. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 against the government, allowing the papers to keep publishing.
It was a chaotic, rushed process that really highlighted the gravity of the decision. What's interesting is that each of the 9 justices wrote a separate opinion majority, concurring or dissenting, which itself just speaks to the profound constitutional tension they were feeling.
But the result was a clear victory for the press.
And for public knowledge.
So the landmark declaration, the quote that establishes the institutional function of the press, this is our parallel to Caliph Umar's acceptance of the sword.
Exactly. The court's core finding, which was articulated really strongly in the concurring opinions, was clear. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government.
That elevates the press beyond just simple reporting.
It enshrines its function as a constitutional corrective mechanism. It assumes the mantle of the man with the sword.
Now let's dig into that comparison. You said the method changes, but the goal preventing deception remains the same. Are we certain, though, that the Supreme Court justices were motivated by the same ethical imperative as the man with the sword? Or was this purely a matter of legal checks and balances?
That's a critical challenge, and it's a fair one. The language used by some of the justices, like Hugo Black, it suggests an absolute moral commitment that goes beyond mere legal pragmatism.
Oh, so?
Well, Justice Black famously argued that the First Amendment means Congress shall make no law, period. And that includes the press. He stated that the Founding Fathers felt that the government should not be allowed, on the basis of its own unsupported claims, to determine what is in the national interest.
That sounds like a highly ethical, almost moral defense of transparency.
It is. He believed the primary purpose of the press was to serve the governed, not the governors.
So, if the 7th century citizen was compelled by the moral duty of Amr bil Maruf, you're saying Justice Black and the majority felt compelled by the duty to protect the constitutional mechanism designed to reveal hack or truth.
Precisely. The legal framework institutionalizes the moral duty.
The principle of exposing deception is the modern constitutional equivalent of straightening the leader.
Yes. Dissent here is secured as a constitutional liberty, a protected right enforced by the judiciary. And the weightiest of government claims, national security, cannot become a pretext for silencing historical truth and covering up decades of government failure. The court acted as the firewall against that first injustice, the suppression of truth.
It's fascinating how the scale changes, but the principle is constant. In Medina, it's one man correcting one ruler. In Washington, it's the judiciary protecting 2 major newspapers against the entire executive branch, dealing with secrets affecting millions of people.
The mechanism is far more complex, but the function is identical: protect the corrective voice. And that function ensures the system is self-healing. If the truth about the Vietnam War could be suppressed, public faith of the government would be built on a foundation of deception.
And the court recognized that protecting the mechanism for truth-telling is more vital to national security in the long run than protecting the secrets of a temporary administration. So we move now from the established constitutional Republic of the United States to Islamabad. And here, The principle of dissent was tested not to defend an existing right, but to establish one in a transitional democracy.
Right, and this shift in context from defending press freedom to guaranteeing assembly rights is really crucial. This case, Benazir Bhutto v. Federation of Pakistan in 1988, is vital because it shows the judiciary acting as the midwife of democracy,
The midwife of democracy, I like that.
ensuring the fundamental conditions for political life are secured after a long period of repression.
Let's set the stage. The context here is critical. This case follows the long period of martial law under General Zia-ul-Haq, who died shortly before the case reached the courts.
That's the essential background. For years, political activity, freedom of expression, all of it had been severely curtailed under the Zia regime. So when Benazir Bhutto, who was on her path to becoming the first female prime minister in the Muslim world, began organizing political rallies,
She faced immediate government resistance. So what was the specific challenge she brought before the Supreme Court? What were the government's tactics to interfere with her?
the government was using administrative tactics to obstruct her political process. Things like denying permits for public rallies, imposing arbitrary time limits, restricting the movement of political workers.
So bureaucratic hurdles.
Exactly. Using bureaucratic hurdles to stifle her ability to campaign effectively and communicate her opposition message to the electorate. She challenged this interference, arguing that these actions violated the constitutional rights that are necessary for a functioning democracy.
So the stakes here were immense. It was about defining the legitimate boundaries of political life itself.
Yes, ensuring that the opposition could actually compete and speak truth to the interim power structure. After years of a system where power was highly centralized and criticism was dangerous, this case was critical for reestablishing the social contract.
It was about moving beyond just tolerating dissent to actually judicially guaranteeing the mechanisms of democracy.
Free association, free speech. Without these rights, elections are just formalities.
And the Supreme Court's ruling was strong. They didn't mince words.
No, the court ruled unequivocally that freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association are not discretionary privileges granted by the state. They are fundamental, inherent necessities for the existence of a democracy. The court defined the legal boundaries necessary for political liberty to breathe.
And what was the essence of liberty as defined by the court in that key holding? That phrase is the legal parallel to Umar's smile.
The court's defining statement was, the right to criticize the government and express political opinion is the essence of liberty.
Simple as that.
Simple as that. If you can't criticize the government, you don't have liberty. If the government can stifle your right to assemble, your right to associate is meaningless. The judiciary mandated that robust public criticism must be protected for the democratic system to maintain legitimacy.
So let's look at the legal impact within the Pakistani framework. How did this decision secure those rights?
It significantly strengthened Article 19 of the Pakistani Constitution, which is freedom of speech and expression, and Article 17, which is freedom of association. By ruling in favor of Bhutto, the Supreme Court used judicial review to push back against the administrative habits left over from the dictatorship.
It forced the state to recognize that the political voice, especially the dissenting voice, must be able to organize, mobilize, and criticize without undue restriction.
It was a formal judicial assertion of the democratic voice.
The contrast with the U.S. case is fascinating. In New York Times, the Supreme Court was defending a right that was already deeply embedded in a long-standing democracy. In the Bhutto case, the court was essentially taking charge of the democratic transition, actively guaranteeing the political space required for dissent to flourish after it had been suppressed.
That's a critical distinction. In Pakistan, the judiciary had to actively fill the vacuum of suppressed rights and define the baseline for democratic operation. It wasn't just defending the constitutional text, it was breathing functional life into it.
And this demonstrates the universal application of the principle.
Yes, the right to question authority is fundamental not just to defending an existing democracy, but to establishing one when the system is under construction. The moral imperative of accountability has to be codified into functioning rights.
So whether the authority being questioned is a powerful caliph, a sprawling Western executive branch covering up history, or an interim government trying to stifle political opposition,
The mechanism of correction, the freedom to speak and organize, is the non-negotiable prerequisite for justice. In all three contexts, the underlying truth is that governance without accountability is tyranny,
and free expression is the indispensable tool used to enforce that accountability.
transforming a moral duty into a political reality.
We've traced this single ethical thread across three profoundly different epochs and legal systems. Now we come to the section that really gives this deep dive its name, the comparative synthesis. We need to move beyond the individual facts and doctrines, the sword, the First Amendment, Article 17, and identify the universal law beneath them. What is the shared ethical mechanism?
This is where we synthesize the comparative judicial ethics sources. We look for the common ratio decidendi, that core ethical justification that makes these cases truly comparable despite their surface differences. We have to examine how accountability operates in each system.
Okay, let's start with the comparison provided in the source material. Action versus defense. How do we compare Caliph Umar welcoming correction versus the Supreme Court defending press freedom?
Well, in the 7th century example, Caliph Umar's action is what we could call proactive solicitation. He initiates the critique. The leader actively welcomes public dissent as proof of his own commitment to justice.
It's a direct, public, highly personalized form of accountability.
And it relies heavily on the moral character of that specific leader.
Right. And in the modern cases.
In cases like New York Times or Benazir Bhutto, the judiciary's role is primarily institutional defense. The executive or the administrative state tries to suppress dissent, and the judiciary acts as the firewall. It steps in to defend the constitutional right against that pressure.
So the action is defensive. It's reactive to state overreach.
But the result is the same, the preservation of the truth-telling mechanism. The difference is where the institutional burden lies. In the 7th century, the burden was on the leader's moral will. In the 20th century, the burden is on the judiciary to enforce the constitutional text.
That's a critical distinction about where the burden of ethical leadership lies. Now, let's compare the source of right. This is maybe the largest ideological leap we have to account for.
Oh, absolutely. In the Islamic Caliphate, the right to speak truth is defined as a moral and religious duty, amr bil ma'ruf. It's a divine and ethical imperative, communal responsibility.
So failure to speak is a sin of omission.
Exactly. Whereas in the modern context,
In both the U.S. and Pakistan, the source shifts to codified constitutional liberty. It's enshrined in state law, the First Amendment, or Articles 19 and 17.
Right. The authority to speak shifts from I must speak because God commands justice to I can speak because the Constitution guarantees my liberty.
But the essential nature is constant. The authority of the state is limited by the citizen's right to question.
The political system formally guarantees the individual's moral right.
So the core political function checking power is universally recognized, even if the source is different. Okay, finally, let's juxtapose the core expression of the principle in these three vastly different settings.
We juxtapose the direct, visceral language from the 7th century. Straight me with your sword if I err.
Unmediated, raw, physically threatening accountability.
Right. And this is mirrored by the systemic institutional declarations of the 20th century. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception, and the right to criticize the government is the essence of liberty.
The vocabulary shifts dramatically, from a sword to a subpoena, from the pulpit to the printed page.
But the underlying message is identical. Authority requires a check, and that check is free expression.
And this synthesis leads us to the source's core thesis, the ratio decidendi, the common ethical thread. Silencing truth is the first injustice. Freedom to question is the first defense of law.
Yes. Let's dedicate some serious time to analyzing that statement because it's the profound takeaway here. Why is the act of silencing the first injustice?
Well, if a leader deviates, say Caliph Umar makes a mistake in administrative law, that's an injustice, but it's salvageable if the corrective mechanism is intact. But the moment you punish the man with the sword, or issue a prior restraint on the press,
or deny a rally permit to the opposition,
you are attacking the mechanism of correction itself.
Exactly. The act of silencing creates the conditions for sustained, compounding injustice. If you suppress the truth, then all subsequent actions by the government, whether they're ethical or unethical, are shielded from public scrutiny. The suppression of truth is a climb that precedes all others.
Because it ensures that those subsequent crimes can never be addressed or corrected. We can trace this cascading failure in each of our case studies. In the 7th century, if Caliph Umar had executed the man, the political culture would have immediately devolved into tyranny. The system would have signaled that submission, not justice, was the highest virtue.
And we know historically that when leaders stopped accepting correction and started demanding blind obedience, systems collapsed from internal corruption and a loss of legitimacy. The original ethical grounding was lost.
In the Pentagon Papers case, if the Supreme Court had allowed the injunction, the institutional message would have been that the executive branch has the power to define historical truth and manage public perception, even when that perception is based on deception.
That would have created a permanent, powerful legal precedent for government opacity, severely crippling the press's capacity to function as an effective check. The cascading effect would be a loss of accountability on everything from military conflict to domestic policy.
So the judiciary recognized that protecting the mechanism was more vital than protecting the short-term political interests of the state.
Absolutely.
And finally, in Pakistan, had the court allowed the arbitrary restrictions on Benazir Bhutto's rallies, the cascading effect would have been the immediate strangulation of the nascent democratic process.
Of course. If the opposition cannot organize, cannot criticize, cannot effectively reach the populace, the mechanism for transferring power peacefully fails before the first election even happens. The first injustice of silencing political organization ensures that subsequent elections are rigged in favor of the incumbent. It renders democracy meaningless.
So freedom of expression isn't merely a political nicety or some ideological stance. It is the operational safety switch on the entire governmental structure.
I like that, a safety switch. It protects the system from its own inherent tendency toward opacity and authoritarianism. It mandates that governance must be conducted in the light, and that the mechanism for holding a mirror up to power must be inviolable.
And the movement from divine guidance in the 7th century to constitutional doctrine in the 20th signifies the secularization and formalization of this ancient ethical imperative.
It does. And that institutionalization attempts to make the principle robust enough to survive even leaders who lack the moral character of Caliph Umar. The 7th century reliance on personal piety is replaced by a written law enforced by an independent judiciary.
The constitutional doctrine attempts to institutionalize the smile of Caliph Umar.
That's a great way to put it. It mandates that governmental deception must be exposed and that political criticism must be tolerated, regardless of who is in power. The universal human requirement for justice remains, but the method of enforcing accountability has formalized into legal rights protected by the courts.
The power of the comparative analysis is just undeniable. It confirms that whether you view governance through a religious, a secular, or a transitional democratic lens, the protection of dissent is the ethical core that guarantees justice and long-term stability.
And what's so fascinating here is that the principle isn't culture-bound, it is functional. Any system that wishes to survive and remain legitimate has to build in a mechanism for self-correction. And that mechanism is freedom of expression. This freedom ensures the system is self-healing, that it resists the self-destructive tendencies of unchecked authority.
And the judiciary's role, whether it's the court in Washington or the court in Islamabad, is not to adjudicate between political factions, but to adjudicate between silence and truth. They protect the mechanism of truth-telling.
They ensure that the citizen's moral duty to speak the truth, that ancient concept of amr bil ma'ruf, is transformed into a legally protected action in the modern state. And the historical record across all three settings confirms that a state which fears the truth cannot be a just state.
It's an incredible realization that the highest legal protections we fight for today are, at their ethical core, expressions of a 7th century mandate for absolute leader accountability.
And they all share the same goal: to enforce the premise that the leader serves the state of justice and the citizen is the guardian of that state, even if they must raise a sword.
This deep dive has shown that the history of accountability is a continuous, powerful thread stretching across the globe. Let's reiterate the central finding from our sources. From the Mosque of Medina to the courtrooms of Washington and Islamabad, the right to question authority forms the cornerstone of every democracy and the conscience of every court.
The ability to question is the most critical safeguard a society possesses. Whether you call it Amr bil Ma'ruf, the First Amendment, or a guarantee under Article 19, its purpose is to ensure that power is never absolute and that those who govern remain aware of their obligations to justice.
The source's moral conclusion really encapsulates everything we've explored today. The voice that questions authority is not a threat to the state, it is the heartbeat of justice.
And without that heartbeat, the state cannot claim legitimacy, and systemic failure is, it's inevitable. We've seen how this first defensive law moved from a direct physical challenge, the sword to sophisticated constitutional guarantees, the tools of dissent evolve.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. We've established that the mechanism of correction must be protected. But today, dissent happens instantly and digitally. It often blurs the lines between legitimate, critical questioning and just noise, or deliberate disinformation, or targeted harassment.
The environment is instantaneous, global, and often anonymous.
So if the freedom to question is the first defense of law, we have to ask, how does this ancient ethical imperative operate when the speed and volume of information threaten to overwhelm the judiciary's ability to protect lawful dissent?
Yeah, the constitutional mechanisms of the 20th century were designed for broadcast media and structured political rallies. They were not designed for the global velocity of the internet.
So what does the sword look like now, when it can be wielded by millions instantly via a keyboard, often bypassing traditional gatekeepers and legal boundaries entirely?
And what is the responsibility of the modern leader, the modern judge, or the modern citizen, when that dissenting voice is amplified a billionfold, making it incredibly difficult to distinguish genuine correction, the ambil marum rough, from disruptive noise?
That's the challenge.
The ethical imperative to allow correction is constant, but the challenge of ensuring that dissent remains lawful and righteous, as it was defined by Caliph Umar, becomes exponentially complex in a hyper-connected world where truth itself is often contested. That's a crucial area for reflection.
Ensuring that the defense of law doesn't get lost in the noise of the digital age. A profound thought to end on as we navigate our hyper-accelerated political landscape. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the enduring ethics of dissent.